Ricky and his friends were telling the new boy in the neighborhood about the strange old hermit who lived outside of town. "He's crazy," Ricky said. The other boys nodded. "He lives in a shack over on Collins Peak." "A shack?" asked Kurt, the new boy. "I swear," said Ricky, holding up his hand. "It's true," added Steve, Ricky's best friend. "He built it against the side of the mountain with old pieces of metal and wood." Kurt shook his head. "That's weird. Who is this guy?" Some of the boys shrugged. "His name is Collins. He's lived up there forever, as long as anybody can remember. That's why they call it Collins Peak," said Sean. "My grandma told me once that he had a sad story," said Nathan, "but that's all she'd say." "It's a sad story, all right," agreed Ricky. "He's a crazy old man who lives in a shack." The rest of the boys laughed. "What does he do up there?" asked Kurt. "Nothing," replied Ricky. "He never talks to anyone, never comes into town." "We think he eats kids," said Steve. "It's true. He hates kids," said Ricky. "Everyone at school knows it. His shack's at the end of a big field, and anytime someone sets foot on it, he comes screaming out of nowhere." He pulled his head down between his shoulders and limped around in a circle. Everyone laughed at that. "Sometimes we dare each other to see who can get the closest to his shack before he comes charging out," continued Ricky. "Why do you say he eats kids?" asked Kurt. "Well," said Ricky, his voice dropping lower as he leaned toward Kurt, "you never know where he is. He sneaks all over these hills, waiting for some kid to do something stupid, like wander in alone. Then it's all over." "What happens?" Kurt asked. "He'll trap that kid, take him back to his shack, where he cooks him slowly over a fire. Then he stores the blackened body carefully so it'll last him for the next couple meals. There's a pit nearby that's filled with all the rotten bones of every kid who's ever disappeared around here." Kurt looked at Ricky suspiciously. "And how many kids is that?" Ricky shrugged. "Don't know, but you better be careful, or you'll be one of them." At that moment, Sean grabbed Kurt from behind and yelled, "Gotcha!" Kurt squealed and jumped, and the rest of the boys howled with laughter. "Rotten bones, yeah, right," Kurt smiled and shook his head. "Okay, you got me. Who knows why he really doesn't want us around his stupid shack," Nathan said after the boys recovered. "Maybe he's got some kind of hidden treasure there. He's been living in the hills for ages. Who knows what he's found? Maybe it's some kind of gold mine." "Then why doesn't he spend a lot of money?" demanded Sean. "Maybe because he knows people would come up there and kick him out," guessed Steve. "Maybe he had a partner and killed him to keep the gold for himself," Kurt suggested. They spent the rest of the afternoon making up wild stories about the old man. That night, Kurt asked his parents if they had heard about the hermit. His father shook his head, but his mother nodded that she had heard something once. "Mrs. Beecham was telling me about him," she explained. "He used to live in town a long time ago. His wife died giving birth to their only son. Then a few years later, his son disappeared. Apparently, he went a little crazy after that. He built some kind of house up on Collins Peak, and he's lived there ever since." "I hadn't heard that," Kurt's father said. "Is he supposed to be dangerous?" "Mrs. Beecham didn't think so. She said he'd lived down there longer than most of the people have in this town. He's never hurt anybody." "Ricky was telling me that he hates kids and chases them away whenever they come near his shack," said Kurt. His father laughed. "I can see it now. Some poor old guy living up in the hills. He must be target for every kid within 100 miles. He turned to Kurt. "I'm sure Ricky is right. This guy has probably been pestered by kids ever since he moved there. Why don't you just leave him in peace, okay?" Kurt shrugged. "Sure, Dad." He bent over his plate and paid close attention to his dinner. The next day, he couldn't wait to talk to his new friends. They all met at Steve's house, and Kurt filled them in on what his mother had told him. "See," said Ricky, "that just proves it. He probably hates kids because he lost his son." "Let's show Kurt the shack," suggested Sean. "I don't know," Kurt said. "My dad said I should leave the old man alone. I think he feels sorry for him." "Don't worry," said Ricky. "We'll only go as far as the edge of the field. That way you can see what we're talking about." Kurt pretended to resist, but was soon heading out of town to Collins Peak with the rest of the boys. They walked to the end of Adler Road, which turned into a dirt trail winding its way into the foothills. Ricky led them to a point where the trail began to bend around the mountain. "Just up around that bend," he said to Kurt in a low voice, "is the old man's field. When we get there, look toward the far end and you'll see his shack." They crept along the trail and gradually a field was revealed. It lay to the right of the trail and was surrounded on 3 sides by steep slopes. It was about as big as a football field, and at the far end stood the hermit's shack. To Kurt, it looked as if the shack were crouched under the oak trees, waiting to pounce on an unsuspecting child. He had no idea how it was held together. There were all different kinds and sizes of metal sheets, aluminum siding, wooden planks, and pieces of plastic. It was hunched up against the side of the mountain, as if any minute it would push against the hill so as to lunge forward all the better. "He lives there?" Kurt asked in disbelief. "That's right," said Ricky. "Nice place, huh?" Suddenly the door of the shack swung open, and the old man rushed out. Kurt figured he must be more than 100 years old. His body was thin, and his bones poked through the holes in his ragged clothes. He had long white hair that stuck straight out and a scraggly beard that hung down to his chest. He looked anxiously around the clearing. The boys shrunk back into the bushes, peeking through the branches. Kurt felt as if the old man were looking straight at him. But nothing happened. The hermit began coughing, and even from where they were, Kurt could hear that horrible gasping. Then the old man ducked back into his hut. Ricky motioned to the others and they backed away down the trail. Once out of sight of the field, they ran all the way back to Adler Road. Then they stumbled to a halt, their chests heaving. "See," said Nathan, "he is one strange-looking old man." "It sounded like he was about to die," Ricky said. They spent the rest of the day playing hide-and-seek in the overgrown weeds and bushes near the end of Adler Road. One morning, a few weeks later, Kurt was eating his breakfast when the doorbell rang. "I got it," he yelled, and ran to the front door. It was Sean. After letting him in, they went up to his room. "Guess what happened last night when Mr. Grafton was walking his dog?" "How should I know?" Kurt asked, lacing up his shoes. "What's going on?" "Mr. Grafton was walking that goofy German shepherd of his up around Adler Rove when the dog started going crazy. So Grafton lets the dog go and it runs over to some bushes and starts barking." "Yeah?" Kurt asked. He forgot about tying his other shoe. "What was it?" "The old man. He had some kind of heart attack or something. So Grafton got the police and an ambulance up there and they took the old man to the hospital." "Wow. How do you know all this?" asked Kurt. Sean practically did a dance. "My sister works at the hospital. She told us this morning at breakfast." "Is he dead?" "Nah, but you know what this means." "What?" asked Kurt. "It means," said Sean, becoming very serious, "that for the first time I can remember, the old man is not at his shack." Kurt realized what Sean was suggesting and started to protest. "Come on," Sean interrupted. "Ricky, Steve, and Nathan are going to meet us at Adler Road." Kurt stood up, chewing his lip while he thought. Sean watched. Then Kurt grinned and threw his arms in the air like a champion boxer. "Let's go." The old man was dying, and he knew it. He opened his eyes and stared at the white walls of the hospital room. He hadn't been in a hospital since his son was born. He turned slowly and looked at the tube in his arm, smiling bitterly. There was no use, but try and tell that to a doctor. Yes, he knew he was dying. He had known it since the coughing began, nearly 6 months ago. First, he thought he had a slight cold, or maybe bronchitis at the worst. But the cough never went away. After the first couple of weeks, it felt like his chest was being ripped apart every time he coughed. And not long after that, he had started coughing up blood. He felt himself falling asleep again. He was so tired. Then he remembered. The cave. He had to tell someone about the cave. He struggled to pull himself into a sitting position and reached for the nurse's bell. Ricky, Nathan, and Steve were already at the end of Adler Road by the time Sean and Kurt got there. Ricky showed the others his Swiss Army knife. "What's that for?" asked Kurt. "Be prepared," intoned Ricky. "That's the Scout motto." Steve rolled his eyes. "Great. We'll call you if we need a fish scaled. Now let's get going." They started up the road. Soon they got to the trail that led up the foothills and to the old man's shack. With mounting excitement, they continued. The nurse ran into the room. "Mr. Collins," she said, pulling his fingers off the bell. "What's the matter?" He grabbed at her wrist and tried to talk, but he felt that sharp, familiar feeling in his chest and began coughing. Only this time he couldn't stop. He held on to the nurse as his body shook and flecks of blood sprayed from his mouth. "Mr. Collins," she said, frightened. "Mr. Collins, let me get the doctor." He shook his head, and with a huge effort he forced himself to stop. "No," he gasped. "Wait. My hut. The cave." He blacked out for a moment, and the nurse hit the intercom asking for a doctor. The boys reached the field and marched bravely toward the far end. As they got closer to the shack, some of their courage leaked away, and they moved slower. "What if he's been released?" asked Kurt. "No way," said Sean. "My sister said they'll have to monitor him for at least 24 hours. "But what if someone else is in there?" whispered Steve. They stopped a few feet in front of the shack. "Hello?" called Ricky. "Anyone home?" They waited, their nerves on edge, but all was silent. The one window of the shack was dark and empty. "Come on," said Ricky suddenly. He strode forward before the others could react and pulled open the door. They all braced themselves for some kind of howling demon to rush out and devour Ricky, but nothing happened. The other boys edged closer. "Hey," said Ricky, "look at that." Kurt couldn't believe it. The back wall of the shack had a door in it, yet the back wall was up against the hillside. "You see?" said Nathan proudly. "I was right. He did find a gold mine." The rest of the hut was quickly examined and judged worthless. There was nothing in it but an old chest of drawers with some scraps of clothing, a small table and a bed. A bowl with some shriveled fruit sat on the table. Ricky positioned himself in front of the back door. It had a bar across it that could easily be lifted off. He looked at the other boys. "Ready, gentlemen?" Old Man Collins swung his mind out of the blackness. The nurse was there, explaining to the doctor why she called him. The doctor leaned over him. "Mr. Collins," he said gently, "you're in pretty bad shape." "My hut," he gasped. "Your hut will be fine," the doctor tried to calm him. "Please try to relax." Mr. Collins grabbed at the doctor's arm, but his strength failed him. He began coughing again. This time, he felt something tear in his chest. And after a sharp pain, there was nothing. His vision grew dimmer, and his hand slipped from the doctor's arm. He was no longer in the hospital room. Instead, he floated over the field where his hut stood. Then he was inside the hut, watching as the boys approached the back door. "Ready, gentlemen?" he heard one of the boys say. The boy grabbed the bar across the back door. He yelled, but they couldn't hear him. The boy slid the bar to the side and threw open the door. Behind the door was the dark mouth of a cave. The old man yelled again, but it was no use. As one, the boys pushed forward to peer inside. Then each one of them felt an invisible force grab at them with terrible strength and pull them deeper inside the cave. Screamed Mr. Collins with all his might. It was the last thing he ever said. "What was he yelling about, Doctor?" the nurse asked as she looked down at the dead body of Mr. Collins. "Delirium," said the doctor. "Who knows what they see just before they go?" Amy's eyes wandered from her book to look out the high windows of the living room. Nothing was there, just snowflakes lightly falling through the sky. Still, Amy shivered. She felt uneasy and a little scared all alone in the Morgans' big house. Little Isabel, the baby, was sound asleep in her nursery upstairs. Amy almost wished the baby would wake back up. At least there would be human sounds in the house to keep her company. She tried to keep her attention on the history book she was reading. Her teacher had warned the class that there might be a quiz on Monday morning, but it was difficult to concentrate, and Amy's eyes kept wandering off the page to look out into the dark night. She must have gone into a daze, staring out the window at the lightly falling snowflakes, because suddenly every muscle in her body jumped when she heard the sound of the front door opening. Amy listened to the click of the latch and then the slight creak of the heavy door as it moved. She even felt a cold draft move through the living room just as she heard the door shutting again. "Mrs. Morgan?" she called out in a frightened voice. "Mr. Morgan?" There was no answer. Only dead silence in the big house. Amy felt her heart begin to pound. Could it have been the wind that pushed the door open and closed again? Or was someone in the house? Amy shrank into a ball on the couch. She was suddenly too afraid to move. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps were moving across the hallway toward the staircase. "Who's there?" Amy called out, her voice trembling. But there was no answer, only the sound of the footsteps slowly climbing the stairs to the second floor. Amy was so afraid now that she felt sick. She sat on the couch, listening to the footsteps climb up one step after another, higher and higher on the staircase. Then, through the panic clogging her mind, she remembered the baby. Isabel. Amy knew she couldn't just hide from the footsteps. She had to make sure the baby was all right. Standing up on trembling legs, Amy began to creep quietly across the living room toward the hallway. Just as she peeked around the corner of the doorway, she heard the footsteps reach the top of the stairs and begin to move across the upstairs floor. Then they stopped. Amy froze where she stood. Terrible thoughts flew through her mind. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to go up and check on Isabel. She pushed the thought of the footsteps out of her mind and raced up the staircase as fast as she could climb the steps. Her heart was pounding, and her breath came in short gasps by the time she got to the top. Several lights were turned on in the hallway, and Amy searched every doorway and corner, but she saw no one there. Quickly, she dashed to the doorway of Isabel's room and flicked on the light. The room was empty except for the baby, who was cuddled in one corner of her crib, sound asleep. Amy strained her ears. There was no sound except for Isabel's light breathing. No footsteps. Not a hint of danger. For a second, Amy wondered if it had all been her imagination. Had she even heard the front door open at all? Had she really heard footsteps on the stairs? Maybe she had fallen asleep and it was all part of a bad dream. Amy looked at the baby one more time and then turned off the light. She tried to walk slowly down the hallway to the stairs, but halfway there she began to run, and she scrambled down the stairs so fast she almost fell. Finally, she ran into the living room and jumped back onto the sofa, curling her feet underneath her. She felt as though she just had a terrible nightmare, but now it was over. With trembling hands, Amy picked up her book again, but a second later, she heard the sound of the footsteps. They were coming back down the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. Amy wanted to scream, but her throat had gone dry and tight. She listened to the footsteps get louder and louder as they came closer and closer to the hallway. In horror, she turned to look through the doorway to the staircase. The footsteps sounded as if they had just reached the bottom of the steps and were coming across the hallway toward her. But she could see nothing. Nothing at all. Amy fixed her eyes on that terrifying, empty space where the footsteps had stopped. Just at the doorway to the living room where she sat. For several agonizing moments, there was silence. Then the footsteps turned away and walked toward the front door. The door latch clicked, and once again, the solid wooden door swung open. Amy heard the heavy footsteps walk outside. Then the door shut, and the house was filled with silence. Slowly, Amy stood up and began to walk toward the front door. She walked over to the place at the doorway where the footsteps had waited. Then she went to the front door and slowly, carefully opened it. The snow was swirling down in big, thick flakes now. She looked down at the sidewalk. In the snow, she saw large, deep footprints walking away from the house. Tomas liked to walk with his grandfather in the high, wind-swept hills that surrounded the small town where he lived. The hills were cut into odd shapes by the wind that had been blowing over them for more centuries than Tomas could imagine. His grandfather told Tomas about the ancient peoples who lived in the hills and were probably still buried there. Tomas listened to his grandfather's stories, but he didn't believe all of them, especially the ones about the dead people. Tomas wasn't the least bit superstitious, and his grandfather's stories were full of warnings about ghosts and evil spirits. One day, Tomas went out walking in the hills by himself. His grandfather wasn't feeling well because his legs were stiff and ached. Tomas promised to bring back a special plant that helped cure the aching. It grew wild in the fields where him and his grandfather often took their walks. Tomas set off from the town on a trail that wound up through the reddish-brown soil into the mountains. He decided to go visit the sheltered, cave-like hollows that the wind had carved into one of the hills many centuries ago. As he walked, he was surprised to find so many rocks fallen on the trail. He remembered hearing the wind last night when it woke him from a deep sleep. But the storm must have been much worse than he realized to have loosened so much dirt and rock from the mountain. Tomas walked on, keeping an eye out for the plant that he promised to bring his grandfather, but he remembered that it grew much higher on the mountain, close to where the hollows were. As he climbed up the trail, Tomas hugged his jacket tighter around his body. The wind was still blowing hard, and it cut through his clothes like a knife. Tomas started to run to stay warm. Soon he came to an overlook and stopped to rest. Below him in the valley, Tomas saw his town. It looked so small and unimportant from where he stood. And suddenly, Tomas felt small and unimportant too, all alone on the mountain. He shivered and thought about turning around and running back home. But he remembered the plant that he'd promised to get his grandfather and started back up the mountain trail. A short time later, Tomas came to the place where another small trail led off toward the hollowed-out caves in the side of the mountain. He could see that the windstorm had been even stronger here. Loose soil and rock were blown into piles where they'd never been before. Finally, Tomas reached the base of one of the hollows, like a dark mouth carved into the side of the mountain. He began to climb up a steep rise to its entrance, but halfway up he came to a sudden stop. Right in front of him on the trail was a white object. It was so white that it seemed to be shining in the sun. Tomas stared at it in disbelief. He'd climbed this rise many times with his grandfather, but he'd never seen this skull before. Tomas stepped up to the skull and bent down on his knees to study it. The skull lay looking back at him with its empty eyes and grinning teeth. Tomas reached down to pick it up, and just as he touched the hard, smooth bone, he remembered his grandfather's words. "Never disturb the rest of the dead." For a moment, Tomas almost dropped the skull. He could still hear the warning note in his grandfather's voice. But now the skull was in his hands, and he wanted to keep it. He could hide it on the bottom shelf of his bedroom closet, and when his friends came over he could show it to them. No one else he knew had a human skull. The skull grinned up at him as Tomas carried it away from the mountain. He knew that the rest of the skeleton had to be buried somewhere nearby, and the grave had been disturbed by the storm the night before. But now the skull was his, and after all, whomever it belonged to was long, long dead. When Tomas came near his house, he pushed the skull under his jacket and hurried into his room to hide it. Then he came out to talk to his grandfather, who sat rocking in a chair by the big living room window. The moment he met his grandfather's eyes, he remembered the plant he had promised to bring. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I forgot the plant, but I'll go back and get it if you want," Tomas stuttered, suddenly feeling as though everything he'd done was wrong. His grandfather told him it was too late for the day, but maybe tomorrow he could go back for the plant. Tomas agreed and then went back to his room. He looked again at the skull, grinning out at him from its hiding place. Suddenly, Tomas wished he had never brought it home. He threw a sweater over top of it and shut the closet door. That night, the wind began to howl again. Tomas went to bed early, after his parents had gone out and his grandfather started telling stories again. Tomas did not want to hear the stories, so he lied and said he didn't feel well. But when he laid down in bed, it didn't seem to be a lie anymore. He didn't feel well. His body was shivery and his stomach ached, and the thought of the skull in the closet filled his mind with uneasy dread. Finally, he couldn't stand to just lie in the dark anymore and think about that skull. He got up, turned on the lights, and opened his closet door. He picked up the sweater he'd thrown over it and saw the skull sitting there, just where he left it, still grinning at him, but now the grin seemed to have an evil edge to it. Tomas slammed the closet door and ran back to his bed, flicking off the light and covering his head with the blanket. After tossing and turning for more than an hour, he fell asleep at last. Tomas wasn't sure what woke him hours later in the middle of the night. Maybe it was the wind still howling outside, or maybe it was the aching feeling in his stomach. But whatever it was made him sit straight up in his bed. He sat there, feeling a shiver travel through his whole body from head to toe. Then he noticed the strange smell in the room, the smell of something old and dead. And as he sat there in the dark, shaking, Tomas heard a strange sound. It was the sound of things that were smooth and hard, clicking against each other. With trembling hands, Tomas reached over and turned on his light. Standing at the end of his bed was a headless skeleton, its long, bony arms reaching out, searching for something. Then, from inside his closet, Tomas heard a weird voice.
Give me back my bones. Give me back my bones.
Tomas shrank down in the bed. He watched as the white skeleton moved around his room, grasping out with bony fingers. The legs stalked over to where he lay, and the cold, bony fingers touched his feet. And still from the closet came the voice.
Give me back my bones. Give me back my bones.
Then the bony fingers of the skeleton moved up to Tomas's head and felt his eyes and nose and lips. Fear choked Tomas's voice as he lay there, unable to scream, waiting for the skeleton to take its revenge. But the voice from the closet called out even louder.
Give me back my bones.
Suddenly, Tomas jumped from the bed and ran to the closet. He opened the door and reached down to pick up the cold white skull. Its hollow sockets looked up at him, and its grinning teeth began to move.
Give me back my bones.
With shaking hands, he carried the skull to the skeleton and placed it on top of its neck. The skull turned its face to him and grinned once more. Then the skeleton walked out of Tomas's room. The next morning, Tomas woke with an awful headache. He rubbed his eyes in the morning sun and suddenly remembered the terrible dream he'd had. He jumped out of his bed and ran to the closet, and he searched and searched, but the grinning skull was gone. Terry woke up and looked at the clock. "Oh no," he groaned. "Time to get up already." Then he remembered. There was no school today. He could lay back on his pillow and tried to figure out how he should feel about classes being canceled. There were no classes because of Mrs. Stowe's funeral. She had been the 5th grade teacher, Terry's teacher. And a couple of days ago, she had been found dead in her home. Murdered. Terry stared at the ceiling. His ex-teacher had always seemed to pick on him, and they had developed a mutual dislike for each other over the year. In fact, the day before she died, the same day he found Midnight, he had been so mad at her that he wished something would happen to her. She had embarrassed him in front of the whole class. When she found out he hadn't done the homework assignment, she made him come up to the blackboard while she instructed him to write the assignment, as if he were a 2nd grader. He was so mad he had wanted to scream. When he heard something had happened to her, he felt guilty. He had never wished she would get murdered, that was for sure. A flying object landed on Terry's stomach. "Hey," he yelled. "Midnight, you stupid cat." Midnight looked up at Terry from her landing pad and began to purr. She had found Terry nearly a week ago. He had been walking home from school when out of nowhere Midnight appeared. She ran right up to him and started rubbing against his leg. He examined her and she looked pretty healthy, but there was no identifying collar. He played with her for a bit, and when he came home, she followed. He named her Midnight because her fur was the deepest, darkest black he had ever seen. His mother came into the room. "Don't forget we're going to Mrs. Stowe's funeral today, Terry." "Come on, Mom, how could I forget that?" His mother smiled. "You'd find a way. Now hurry up, Scott'll be here soon." Most of the 5th grade class was at the funeral. Terry made sure to stand with Scott, who was his best friend. "This is pretty weird," Scott whispered halfway through the ceremony. "I mean, who would have thought to kill Mrs. Stowe?" Terry nodded. "I know," he whispered back. "It's not like she was my favorite teacher or anything, but geez." Scott continued. "I heard she was hacked up into little pieces." "Who told you that?" Terry demanded. "Shh!" Terry's mother hushed him before he got the answer, and he turned forward. The minister gave a long speech about Mrs. Stowe's dedication to her students. He was followed by Mr. Keller, the school principal. Terry tried not to fidget, but he really wanted to know more about what Scott had said. After the funeral, the kids piled back into their parents' cars. Terry talked his mom into letting him and Scott walk back to the house together. "What did you mean when you said she got all hacked up?" Terry asked as soon as his mother was out of earshot. Ryan heard his dad talking about it. He said she was torn apart. It was possible, Terry thought. After all, Ryan's dad was a policeman. Do they have any idea who did it? Ryan says they don't have a clue. They reached Terry's house and spent the rest of the morning reading comic books. Scott had to go home at lunchtime to watch his little brother. Terry flipped on the television and sat on the couch. Soon, Midnight came into the room and curled up against his leg. He wondered about Mrs. Stowe. How strong would a person have to be to actually tear a human body apart? He shivered. No matter how stupid she made him feel, he would never have wished that on her. No, that kind of punishment had to be reserved for people who really deserved it. Like Howard, the school bully. Terry grunted. All the kids hated Howard. He was the biggest kid in 6th grade and he beat up on everybody. Once he had sent Terry home with a cut lip, and Terry had been too frightened to tell his parents what had really happened. He told them he had fallen on the playground. Yeah, he thought with a nod of his head. Howard was a person who deserved to be torn to shreds. The next day was school as usual, but when Terry got there, the playground was buzzing with excitement. Scott ran over to him as soon as he saw him. "You're not gonna believe this," Scott practically yelled. He had a wild look and his voice sounded shaky. "What?" "You know they think Mrs. Stowe was murdered?" Terry nodded. "Well, guess who the latest victim was?" Scott waited for effect, then practically shrieked. "Howard!" Terry felt a chill creep over his skin, as if some unseen hand were plucking at his arm hairs. "Howard?" he asked in a low voice. "Are you serious?" Scott nodded like his head would fall off. I know, I didn't believe it either. But he didn't show up for class this morning, and then Mr. Keller came by and made the announcement that Howard had been found dead." "Did he say how?" asked Terry in a daze. Scott frowned. Of course not. But by the end of school, word had filtered through the playground grapevine that Howard's throat had been slashed. Terry listened to each new detail with increasing panic. He had trouble concentrating during class and was almost surprised when the bell rang at the end of the day. Terry caught a ride home with Scott's mother, and when he got there, he practically ran inside. He slammed the door behind him and dove onto the couch. Was it possible? No, it couldn't be. He buried his head in his hands and tried to convince himself that he had nothing to do with Howard's or Mrs. Stowe's deaths. His mind was racing. He couldn't help thinking about a television movie he saw once, about a man who had trouble with his memory, and at the end of the movie, the man found out that during his blackouts he had been killing people. Is that what's happening to me? Terry wondered out loud. No, that was impossible. How could he have gotten to Mrs. Stowe's house? She lived on the other side of the town. And how could he have done what Ryan's father had said was done to her body? And as for Howard, sure, he had just been thinking that it was Howard's turn for some punishment, but there was no way he could have done anything about it. It had to be coincidence, Terry finally convinced himself. He felt a little better after that and went to his room to do his homework. The rest of the month passed uneventfully. Terry's mother left town to help with her sister, who was in the hospital. Terry slowly forgot about his suspicions that he was a deranged killer who unconsciously murdered everybody he didn't like. Instead, he started to think about Diane's birthday party at the end of the month. The entire 5th grade class was going, and it was shaping up to be the event of the semester. The Friday before the party, everyone was making plans to meet the next day. Terry got home and did his homework so he wouldn't have to worry about it over the weekend. Then, because his dad still hadn't come home, he made himself a sandwich to snack on. Midnight came strolling in, and Terry chased her around the kitchen. Then she darted into the living room and began racing around with Terry in hot pursuit. Suddenly, she tore down the hall, and when Terry jumped after her, he crashed against the corner of his dad's display case. He yelled and stumbled to the floor. Then his blood chilled as he heard the sounds of breaking glass. He slowly turned to look. The display case stood on 4 thin legs with 2 glass doors. Inside was his father's collection of old camera equipment. Now the case lay toppled over, and Terry knew with a sick feeling what he would find when he stood up. Sure enough, the glass doors had broken when the ancient projector had fallen against them. What Terry didn't know was whether or not he had ruined the cameras and projector as well. He cleaned up the mess as best he could and waited in agony until his father came home. His father noticed the damage the minute he walked in. "What happened here?" he asked in a disturbingly quiet voice. "I'm sorry, Dad. I was chasing Midnight and I tripped and fell against the case. It was an accident." His father didn't say anything right away, but walked over to inspect his collection. Then he turned to Terry. "You know better than that." Terry hung his head. That was the worst part. He did know he wasn't supposed to run around the living room. "Yes," he admitted. His father nodded and studied the shattered glass doors. "Well, I'm going to have to go and get some glass cut tomorrow. Then I'll see if I can rehang these doors. And I think while I'm out, that would be a perfect time for you to sit quietly and think about why I make rules about what you should and should not be doing in the house." With dawning horror, Terry realized what his father was saying. "You mean I'm grounded?" he asked in a panic. "That's exactly what I mean." "But Dad, you can't, not tomorrow. Diane's party is tomorrow. Everyone'll be there." "Not everybody," his father turned to look at him. "Because you'll be here. No arguments." Terry opened and closed his mouth silently. He could feel hot tears beginning to burn his eyes. He knew it was useless to argue, so he ran to his room and threw himself on the bed. It wasn't fair. He didn't mean to knock the stupid case down. His tears filled his eyes and ran down his cheeks. Everyone was going to the party. Why did his dad have to be so mean? Midnight came in and jumped on the bed next to him. Terry angrily shoved her away. "Get out of here, you stupid cat," he cried. "It's all your fault." Later at dinner, he tried to persuade his father to change his mind. He offered to stay home Sunday instead, or all weekend next week. But his father wouldn't budge. Terry went back to bed in a black mood and fell asleep, planning to run away. That would teach his father to not be so hateful. In the middle of the night, he heard a sound. He opened his eyes and looked around the room. Then he switched on the light at the side of the bed. Midnight had pushed the door open slightly and was backing into the room. Terry watched curiously, trying to figure out what the cat was doing. Some trick of the light made Midnight seem much bigger than usual. Then Terry realized she was dragging something with her mouth. As the cat backed further into the room, Terry saw the prize she carried. A scream ripped from his throat as he saw a bloody head. It was his father. Midnight dragged it all the way into the room and turned to look at Terry proudly. Terry kept screaming until he realized that his mother was not coming either. Then he picked up the bedside lamp and hurled it at the cat. Midnight was taken by surprise, but the lamp was pulled short at the last second by the power cord, which was wrapped around one leg of the bed. The cat jumped back and hissed at Terry. "Get away from me!" Terry screamed. He jumped out of bed and grabbed his baseball bat from behind the door and swung it at the animal. Midnight jumped aside and Terry missed. He was panting with fear and almost blinded by tears, but he was still able to see the change coming over the cat. She was growing bigger. She prowled back and forth and her tail cut through the air like a whip. And with each turn she took, her body swelled larger. Terry threw the bat at the creature and squeezed out the door, slamming it shut. He stepped in something sticky and flipped on the hall light. He was standing in the trail of blood that led from his parents' room to his bedroom door. As his mind tried to accept this information, a crashing blow shook the door in its frame. Terry jumped back and watched in terrified fascination as blow after blow hit the door. Then, with a noise like a saw blade cutting through wood, a huge black paw tore through the door. Terry backed slowly away, his mind no longer functioning. He watched the big black cat try to push its way through the hole. It now stood nearly as tall as Terry at its shoulders. Terry turned to run. There was a roar from behind him and the door splintered apart. He ducked into the bathroom and slammed the door behind him. A second later, the monster hit it from the other side. Terry clawed frantically at the bathroom window while the black cat battered at the door. Then, with a final thought that snapped his mind, he remembered that the window was barred on the outside. Numbly, he turned to face the bathroom door, just as the cat began to shoulder its way through. During the California gold rush of 1849, 3 men were holed up in a small cabin for the night. They sat around the jumping flames of the fire and warmed themselves. Outside, the wind whistled and moaned through the canyon. Every so often, a coyote howled. The 3 men were old friends who had shared the hopes and disappointments of gold prospecting. This was their last night out in the hills. The next day, they planned on heading to San Francisco to find work. All of them were broke. "Damn coyotes," Billy said. "We're lucky we found this place," Jeremiah said slowly. "They're hungry tonight." Another coyote howled above the sound of the wind. This one was closer. The 3 men looked at each other nervously. "I still don't like moving into deserted cabins like this," the 3rd man, named Dusty, complained. "You don't know why people left." He paused for a moment. "Nobody leaves without a reason." "Well, you can go out and sleep with the coyotes then, Dusty," Jeremiah said as he rolled out his sleeping bag. The fire was beginning to burn lower. The other 2 men rolled out their bags and settled down for the night. All was silent inside the cabin. Outside, the coyotes and the wind kept up their eerie symphony. Jeremiah woke from deep sleep with a start. He looked around, trying to remember where he was. The cabin, yes, the cabin, he thought drowsily. But what had woken him? He lay his head back down and shut his eyes. Then he heard it. The breathing. It was fast, excited breathing, coming in short gasps. He looked over to the fireplace where Billy was sprawled out, asleep. Jeremiah's blood froze at what he saw. A face, nothing but the hideous face of an old woman, was hovering over Billy's body. The short gasps of breathing were coming from the hag's face. Jeremiah could see the lips opening and closing with the breathing. "Billy!" he screamed. Billy shuddered in his sleep. Then he raised himself to his elbows and slowly opened his eyes. His face was only 2 inches from the face of the old hag. Jeremiah watched as his eyes widened in horror as he looked at it. The hag's face was old and wrinkled. The skin was blistered by the sun and disease. Hair stood out on her head like twisting snakes, and her eyes were full of hatred. Jeremiah could hear its panting breath come faster. Billy parted his lips in a scream. Then the hag breathed a long, deep breath into his lungs. As Billy's body slumped backwards, the face disappeared. "My God," Jeremiah said softly. He didn't believe in ghosts, and his mind couldn't make any sense of what he had just seen. But that didn't make any difference now. He kicked Dusty with his foot to wake him up. Then he ran over to check Billy, but Billy was dead. "We gotta get out of here, Dusty," Jeremiah said. "Billy's dead. There was a face, an old hag's face. I don't know, it was a ghost or something." Dusty was lying on his sleeping bag, eyeing Jeremiah suspiciously. "You cracking up, Jeremiah?" he asked. But Dusty didn't say any more, because he found out what Jeremiah meant. The face materialized out of the air in front of him. Once again, the cabin filled with the sound of the old hag's breathing. Dusty's face worked itself into an expression of horror. "Keep your mouth shut, Dusty," Jeremiah screamed in warning, but it was too late. Dusty's mouth opened wide in a scream. The hag's face breathed death into his body through its withered lips. Then it disappeared. Jeremiah backed against the cabin wall. He looked down at his 2 dead friends. A coyote pierced the silence with its hungry howl. Jeremiah ran for the door. A foot away from escape, the hag's face appeared before him. Jeremiah's legs stiffened with fright. His hand froze on the door latch. The old woman's eyes were looking into his. He could see the pattern of wrinkles and scars on her face. He could feel her panting breath and felt himself choking. His breath seemed stuck in his lungs. The face was coming nearer and nearer. He struggled to keep his mouth shut. He thought of Billy and Dusty. He jerked aside the door latch and threw the cabin door open, watching as the door swung right through the hag's face. She disappeared once again. Jeremiah grabbed the rifle by the door and ran down into the canyon. He ran until he felt his lungs would burst. His own hard breathing sounds haunted him. It sounded like the breathing of the old hag following him. He kept running until the night broke into daylight. Finally, he threw himself down, exhausted, on a flat rock. For the first time since his escape from the cabin, he began to gather his distracted thoughts. Billy and Dusty were dead. Something had killed them. Jeremiah could still see the hag's hideous face in his mind. What was she? He wondered. The mad ghost of a prospector's wife seeking revenge? An evil spirit left by the indigenous people who had been forced out of these mountains by the gold rush? Or was that the face that death wore? And now that she had shown herself to him, was there any escape? Suddenly, Jeremiah realized how horrible his situation was. Someone was sure to find Billy's and Dusty's dead bodies, and nobody would believe his story about the hag's face. People would say he killed his partners for gold, and there would be no way for him to explain it. For a moment, Jeremiah thought he might go crazy. Then, he realized there was only one way out. He had to get out of the mountains fast before someone found the bodies. Far in the distance, he saw the dusty trail of a stagecoach. It was coming his way up the mountain. There was the answer, he decided. He would ride the stagecoach out of the territory. Jumping to his feet, Jeremiah ran down the canyon to the stagecoach road below. He had little time to catch his breath before he flagged down the driver. "Climb in, there's plenty of room," the driver shouted at him. As Jeremiah climbed into the coach, he saw that there was only one other passenger, a woman. He settled back into his seat and looked across at her. She was young and beautiful. He smiled to himself as he thought of his luck. Not only had he escaped the horrible death-breathing hag, but now he was sitting across from this charming girl. The young woman saw him looking at her, and she smiled shyly back at Jeremiah. As the stagecoach rocked slowly from side to side, Jeremiah's tense body began to relax. Everything will work out all right, he thought to himself, and he drifted off to a contented sleep. He woke suddenly with a start. His heart was pounding wildly. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The stagecoach. Yes, the stagecoach, he thought drowsily. But what had awakened him? Then he heard it. The breathing. It was fast, excited breathing, coming in short gasps. Jeremiah looked up. The young woman was staring at him. He saw her lovely lips opening and closing with the breathing. Jeremiah's eyes took on a wild look. He thought of Billy and Dusty. The breathing seemed to get louder. It seemed to pound in his ears. He crouched into the corner of the stagecoach. Desperately, he looked out the window. The coach was going around a hairpin curve next to a cliff that fell sharply to the deep canyon below. He looked at the woman again. She was still staring at him. Her breath was coming louder still. The whole stagecoach seemed to fill with it. "No," Jeremiah moaned softly. "Is there something wrong?" the young woman asked as she got up from her seat and sat beside Jeremiah. He shrank back against the stagecoach door. He watched as the woman's face came closer to him. She was lifting her hand to his forehead. He could feel her breathing against his face. "No!" Jeremiah screamed as he turned the latch on the door and jumped out of the stagecoach. His scream echoed up from the canyon as his body tumbled down the steep cliff. Then, the young woman heard no more. She sat sobbing in the stagecoach, terrified with fright. It was her first trip out west, and she just watched as a man that she'd never met before leapt to his death. It was the night guard's first night of duty in the Egyptian rooms of the museum. He had been assigned to work in the Viking room for many months before this. He plopped his large body down on a hard bench by the wall. His bloodshot eyes surveyed the room. There were huge stone sculptures of lions with the heads of men, and wall paintings filled with strange symbols. There were jars, clothing, utensils, and, what interested him the most, mummies and coffins. "I should have myself a good time in here," he muttered to himself, and then he let out a cackling laugh. The guard had a good time in the Viking section of the museum as well. That was the reason for his transfer to the Egyptian wing. No one had been able to prove he had done it, of course, but he knew he was suspected. It was worth it, though. He had enjoyed scratching that word into the old Viking stone and putting that cigarette butt into the mouth of the fake Viking warrior. There were other things he had done too, things that they hadn't even caught yet. He hated museums, always had, ever since his mother had dragged him through them as a child. and he didn't like being a night guard in this museum. But what else could he do? It was the only job he could find. Anyway, at least he could make sure that he wouldn't get bored. The guard heaved his heavy body off the bench and began making a slow circuit around the long room. After a few steps, he stopped in front of a huge wall painting. It was filled with weird symbols and pictures of people with animal heads. A woman with the head of a bird, a man with the head of a cow, another man with the head of a fox. There was also a bird with the head of a man, and a monstrous thing with the head of an alligator. "Rubbish," the guard muttered. But he stooped to see the title of the picture on the wall plaque. "The Seal of Judgment," it read. Underneath the title were these words: "The Egyptians thought that when a man died, his soul went before judges, all seated in a great hall. The judges wanted a report on the way he had behaved while on earth. Then the man's heart was weighed on a scale against a feather, the symbol of truth and justice. This was to find out if the man had spoken the truth to the judges. If he had lied, he was immediately fed to the monster with a crocodile head." The guard finished reading the plaque on the wall. Then he looked at the picture again. The scale was there, a heart on one side and a feather on the other. And the monster with the crocodile head was waiting beside the scale. The guard took a few steps backwards from the wall painting, but he didn't take his eyes off the crocodile. It fascinated him. "Does it scare you?" The voice made every muscle in the guard's body jump. He swung his large body around to face the speaker. It was the assistant curator of the museum, smiling. "I didn't mean to scare you," the curator said in a slow, measured voice. "I wanted to know if the painting scared you." The guard was embarrassed now. His embarrassment quickly turned to anger. "That old junk doesn't scare me," he said. "What do you mean sneaking up on me like that?" The guard glared down at the short curator. "I didn't sneak up on you," the curator answered in slow speech. "On the contrary, I walked quite normally. It's your job to be alert, after all." The guard didn't reply. He was seething with anger. "And furthermore," the curator went on, "this isn't junk. Our museum has one of the best collections of Egyptian artifacts in the world." "Doesn't interest me," the guard said, walking away from the curator. "I think it's junk." The curator's face went red. "We're on to your tricks, you know. If we weren't so short-staffed, I'd have you fired." The guard turned around and stared at the curator with an insolent look on his face. "You just watch yourself," the curator kept it up. "If you disturb anything in this room, you could be sorry. The Egyptians knew a lot about magic and curses, and had great respect for their dead. You had better not try any of your tricks in here." The little curator continued his lecture until he walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The guard began his circuit of the room again. Now he had a surly scowl on his face. As he passed the Egyptian paintings and statues, he began to hate them more and more. The humans with animal heads seemed to threaten him with their beaks and claws and strange, passive faces. "You better watch yourself," the guard mimicked the curator's words. "They can have this job," he muttered. The guard stopped to pull out a stick of chewing gum from his pocket. In front of him was a wooden coffin. The sign beside it indicated that it belonged to a princess. It was in the shape of a human body. The coffin bottom lay flat on the floor. The decorated coffin lid stood upright at the foot of the bottom. As he began to chew his gum, the guard stared at the pictures on the decorated lid. The body of the lid was covered with feathers, human figures, snakes, and strange symbols. On top of the lid, there was a face, the face of an Egyptian woman. She had large, almond-shaped black eyes. The guard found himself staring into them. Ow! The guard had bitten his tongue while chewing his gum. The pain snapped him back to reality. For a moment, he had become lost in that woman's eyes. He put his fingers in his mouth and took out the gum. He looked around for a place to put it. Opposite the coffin was a mummy. It was the son of the princess. The guard looked at the mummy's human shape, wrapped in yellowing strips of cloth. He laughed under his breath. Then he stuck his piece of gum onto the back of the mummy's head. Now he laughed louder. But suddenly he stopped. He felt as though someone was behind him, watching. He whirled around, but no one was there. Only the coffin. The woman's eyes were staring at him just as before. The guard started to walk away from the coffin, but he found he couldn't take his eyes away from the woman's face. They seemed to be paralyzing his body. The first sickly feeling of fear crept into the guard's mind. He remembered the curator's words. They had magic and curses, and respected their dead. Then he remembered that the mummy was this woman's son. The guard struggled to leave the spot where he stood. He swore at the coffin lid. He tried to reach out and knock it over, but he couldn't help himself. He seemed to be sinking deeper and deeper into the black eyes of the woman. Those eyes seemed to beckon him, to hypnotize him. They were like bottomless black pits set into the white, passive face of death. The guard found himself being drawn forward, toward the coffin. His brain was slowing down, becoming sleepy. As he came within inches of the woman's eyes, suddenly they closed. Instantly, his own eyes went toward the coffin bottom. He saw that it was bigger than it first seemed, big enough for him to lie down in. The guard was falling asleep. He let his body slip down into the soft, cushioned bottom of the coffin. He stretched himself out. With his hands by his side, his body fit perfectly. Just before he fell asleep, the guard opened his eyes once more. He looked up at the inside of the coffin lid, which faced him at the bottom of his feet. He saw the woman's face was painted on the inside of the lid, too. Her eyes were watching him, but these eyes were blacker yet. Black with revenge. The guard slipped off into strange dreams, just as the coffin lid fell neatly down over the coffin bottom. He lay in darkness. Then, the airtight, eternal darkness of an Egyptian coffin. And somewhere, the monster with the crocodile's head was waiting for him.